Welcome to the award-winning Farm to School podcast, where you will hear stories of how you thrive and farmers prosper when we learn how to grow, cook, and eat delicious, nutritious, local food in schools across the country and the world.
Hey everyone, we're your hosts, Michelle Markison.
And I'm still Rick Sherman. And today we're doing a second part in a two-part series. That's how you do that, a second part, if it's a two-part series. But we already interviewed, we're doing an Ecoliteracy bit where we introduced an author to you all, Katherine Pryor, on the last episode. And this episode, we're going to hear the other side of the page, as it were, the publisher. So with us today, we have Philip Lee with Readers to Eaters.
Yay,
and we're a publishing
Philip.
house out of San Francisco, California. Is that correct, Philip?
Yes, in San Francisco.
Now, Philip and I go way back. I met him, I think, the same time as I met Katherine at a Farm to School conference. And at the time, I think you were based out of Seattle, but you've since relocated down to where the mothership is, so to speak. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
We're talking briefly when we were prepping for this, and you're, from my standpoint, one of the few publishers that specifically market to youth and teaching kids about where their food comes from. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, we were talking about how do we talk about nutrition and food, and what is different about it from your end?
Yeah, well, again, first of all, thanks for having me on the program. Love your show. Again, so I have this company called Readers to Eaters. I started with my wife, Jolie, and we started back in 2009, so just over 15 years. And it's interesting. What we do is we tell stories about food. So we publish children's books about food. And it's interesting because a lot of people think, well, books about food means we're book publishers, or we help tell books about health and nutrition. Well, many of our books, all our books is about food, but many of our books don't have recipes in it. It's not about cooking. And the health and nutrition part is also it's there, but it's assumed. We're not nutritionists. We're not trying to tell people what to eat. We just want to tell people about food. And more importantly, we tell stories about people behind the food. So food in many ways is our way to introduce kids to the people who grow it, cook it, and provide it in our community in all different ways. And then another element to that is that we try to include cultural connections to food. What does this food mean to us as a family, as cross-culture, nationalities, and so on? So a lot of our stories involve that, and I don't mean, again, who cooks it, but how do we prepare it? What are food traditions? All these different things. Okay. And I'll share some specific examples, but that's really our focus when we started. We started a company, again, back in 2009, partly, and I say 2009 as a real kind of a critical point, because we started about 5 or 6 weeks after Michelle Obama started the White House Garden. And then at the same time, I think that same spring, we went to Portland, Oregon for I think it was the National Farm to Cafeteria. I forget what it's called, but it's essentially the Farm to Cafeteria Conference. And I personally met a lot of these really great, food garden educators there. And I was really inspired, honestly. And I had been a publisher for a very long time. I previously started another company. It's called Lee & Low Books in New York. And it was one of the first publishers about diverse books, for children's. And so I come to this conference at the Farm to Table conference. And again, I was really inspired by the work, the conversation, the commitment of the people. I do think something was missing. It's since I've been in children's book already, my connection, my partners have been teachers and librarians. And at this conference, at the Farm to Table conference, I asked the same question, well, where are the teachers and librarians? Is that something that I can, is that a space that I can contribute and bring more people into the conversation about food education, or these understanding about our food? And that is my entry point. I feel like there's an opportunity there. So my wife and I jumped in without even, a clear business plan about what exactly we're going to do. But we just feel like we can maybe, we love the people in that space and we want to be part of that community. And I also want to add, actually, since I come from a publishing background, my wife comes from the food background. She's a food ethnographer. So she studies, American food culture.
What is that?
Anthropologist.
Food ethnographer?
Ethnographer, yeah, like ethnography. That's like an anthropology kind of methods, of studying culture, and in fact, for the last 10 years, she's been the food ethnographer for Google. And which is partly what brought us down to the Bay Area. And so she studies food culture. And when we say like studying food culture, it's not just asking people like what they eat, but really by understanding, you can ask people how their attitude about, of course, climate issues and, all kinds of subjects. And it's certainly which probably shape how they're going to eat, right? We'll all vote with our fork, and so, and there's generational difference. So she looks at how, baby boomers eat differently from their, millennial children, and the Gen Xers different from the Gen Z children, and so on. And so, and so it's really kind of combining our interests and her interest in food. So kind of our company is called Readers to Eaters. So to some degree, I'm the reader because I come from books, and she's the eater because she comes from food. There's that too. Plus, it also kind of Readers to Eaters all reflect a lot of the community, the partnership work that we do, and maybe I can get into that a little bit more in a little bit. Yeah, but that's really kind of the roots to how we started this company.
Well, you said you were going to give a couple examples of your cultural highlights, and we're looking at a table full of your books right now, which I've bought over the years, and you've sent me some to share.
Yeah.
But yeah, could you share some examples of that, what you were thinking of?
Yeah, well, I'll do it kind of somewhat chronologically, So again, when we first started in 2009, I mentioned when we started the company, we didn't start right away as a book publisher. We started off as a pop-up bookstore about food at farmers markets. So we were, we were based in the Seattle area. We're actually in Bellevue, Washington, and so we were across many of the farmers market across, that part of the Puget Sound area of Washington, going to different farmers markets, selling books about food, and really just learning for us to connect with the food community, the growers, other educators, and it was interesting for us. I think personally I learned a few things. Is that first of all, again, people coming to buy our books, and they're really interested in stories about food. But particularly, our best-selling books are our children's books. The parents really want to engage a conversation with their children. Again, this goes back to how things might have changed. The idea, if you look back to that time, the whole idea about buying organics in the farmers markets was still newer. Obviously we're much later. But I was getting parents who are like buying, let's say, conventional eggs, but they'll buy organic eggs, for their children. And buying separately, but they're really still trying to understand the value behind what's the difference, right? And so, and have that conversation with their kids, why eating certain vegetables were important. So again, since I come from a publisher background, so we started as a bookstore selling different publishers' books, but all of a sudden, and still wasn't enough. I felt like, it's not like there's a huge variety of books out there. And so I just felt like, well, there's an opportunity for me to go back to what I've been doing all along, which is create children's books. And so that's really kind of start the idea of launching books. And along the way, and so I really start developing ideas of books that I want to do. And then I met a personal friend who happened to be a school librarian, Rick Swan, who also happened to want to write a book about school gardens. Yep. And so it was so perfect for us. And so we just start talking about editing this one of our first project. Simultaneously, our family was working on food bank on weekends. And then at this food bank, we were at this one table next to this young couple who were giving out plant starts to the food bank families.
Wow.
And it was Katherine Pryor and her husband. And so we just and I just thought, what a brilliant idea. Instead of just giving out plant starts for people who know what to do with it. I mean, a lot of the family at this food banks were, Latino families, and tomatoes, very common food. Versus like there are other people there who were like giving out kale salad and like showing people how to make kale salad, which is great, but it's not necessarily culturally connecting with a lot of the people who were there, the families who were there. So I thought, so we just started having this conversation with Kathy, and we became friends. And it wasn't like right away, but months, maybe even more than a year later, then, she mentioned that she has a story idea. And in fact, she just wanted to ask me to take a look at it because I'm a publisher. And then I looked at it and I said, I want it.
Wow.
And that's Sylvia Spinach. And so that's really, so our first season. So we, again, children's books, it takes us about a year and a half to 2 years, and sometimes even longer to make a book. So we started company in 2009. We started having these ideas, 2010 maybe, and then the books didn't come out. Like this first 2 books, Our School Garden and Sylvia Spinach, didn't come out till 2012. And so that's really kind of our launch. And then actually also in that year 2012, a book that Rick, you're familiar with, called Feeding the Young Athlete. Yeah. We also published in the fall of that year, 2012. So that's our first 3 books, that we published. And Feeding the Young Athlete, scares a little bit older and probably our only truly recipe book. But we want a book that engage older reader, to think about food. And it's especially the older they get, the less likely what we find is that they would listen to the parents or like starting to make their own food choices, but they would listen to the coaches. They would listen to because it connects with an activity. And honestly, even as a parent, we would just see, what do you sports team and go do an activity and then go and have a donut party afterwards. And that's not exactly what your body needs, And so again, we met this nutrition professor and also culinary professor at Western University outside Seattle. And so we just started talking, and that's how that book, Feeding the Young Athlete, came about. So in the beginning, we come up with those 3 stories, and I'm so glad you got to talk to Katherine Pryor already. And Sylvia Spinach is a really great way to introduce kids, to not just like about growing food. Certainly, it's about what took place in the school garden, about a girl who was not a fan of spinach, but had to grow it, and and then finally had to taste it and try it like that at the school garden, and felt to see she enjoyed it, And and one of the conversations we look at, and subsequently, even with the books that follows, is that we want to introduce. Here's a story, and we could see when kids read these stories, hear these stories, they are so much more inclined to go try it because there's in this case, Sylvia Spinach is a fictional story, but still it's a person. Like they're not just reading about how spinach is good for you. They're experiencing what a girl, in this case, this girl goes through to her reluctance, and that it, and then trying something and liking it. And we don't want to say, hey, like your first taste is great, it's amazing, this is so good, and where's it been all along? That's not how kids really experience the first food. But she experiences first food because she's reluctantly tasted it, and she bites into it and there's a crunch to it, and her reaction is, it's not bad. Right. And and not bad for a lot of these kids. It's a win, it's that good experience. And that's really how we want to approach it. We want to get kids away from yuck and yum, right? And we don't even want to label kids picky eaters. Like sometimes it could be even just particular preferences. So since then, Katherine had also written Zora Zucchini and some of our other books that we published. We're always trying to introduce kids to flavor and texture, and it could be a story about a person and it could be about an event, but we find that in order to get kids away from yuck and yum, it's like they first have to have the vocabulary, the basic vocabulary to flavor. Like, is it because it's sour, sweet, bitter, umami, like salty? If they have those words, they sure can make their food a little more delicious on their own. Even with, again, working with garden educator, and one of the wonderful things about working in the garden is that they can pick up something and eat it right there, right? But then but that's like eating off the garden. But if you want them to eat a bowl of salad, it's not like, it sure tastes a little bit better with maybe a little dressing on it, rather than just eating like straight bowl of, lettuce leaves or even tomato. But, and then I let kids know, it's like, with flavor, just when they understand there's all these, like, again, sour, sweet, and bitter, and so on, people have preferences, and my wife likes it more acidic, so she puts more vinegar into it. I like mine more sweet, so I put like some berries into my salad, and again, it doesn't make us any more picky, but we have a different preference. And then once kids understand these basic concepts, then we also introduce the cultural conversation, because, you think they are like a standard, like bitter is bitter, sour is sour. But what happened is, like, then I let kids know, like, well, I'm Chinese and I grew up eating bitter melons and even broccoli, right? And, they tend to crinkle their nose at bitter, but it's like, but if you understand that other people may like bitter, but like bitter is okay. And if you eat chocolate, if you eat like even coffee, then they have a different connection to bitter. And I let them know, like, my wife was Korean and she likes her food spicy, and
Sure.
and even more than I do. And so, that's a cultural difference. And then we can even, like, I have a good friend who's Iranian, and he said, well, the flavor of their culture is sour. And so again, like, kids tend to crinkle their nose at sour, and it's like, well, sour can be very important to certain culture. And then when I work with new immigrant population, and I ask them, what's the flavor of America? And they all say sweet, because we put sugar in everything, and so this is the conversation that we can even do at, the Sylvia Spanish first, second grade, or even preschool level. They have some understanding of that taste, and so it's just being able to have that word to articulate it and to share it, and for them to even understand, like, well, see, that's why somebody else may like this food more, because bitter is okay, or sour is okay. It's not a bad word.
Philip, there's one thing in our farm to school world I hear from time to time over and over again. When you're teaching kids about school garden produce or whatever, it's called "Don't yuck my yum." You ever heard that?
Yep.
Don't
Absolutely.
yuck. And that kind of resonates really well in here, because culturally or whatever, what I'm used to might not be what you're used to, what you were growing up with, what I grew up with. And it's okay to try different things, now and then. That's the important thing. And if you don't like it, that's okay. But at least gives them the opportunity to try things. I think that's really good. But in terms of some of the specifics I saw in your books, like you talked about cultural differences, but there's some people like Zora, who is a fictional character in Sylvia, but then you have Sandor Katz and Farmer Will Allen and real people in real places that you highlight too, which is, I think, fantastic.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that, because that was exactly where I was going to go next.
Okay.
Because actually, we published this Food Hero series, and it's starting with this book that you mentioned, Farmer Will Allen and the Growing Table. And Will Allen is a very well-known urban farmer out of Milwaukee, and who won the MacArthur Genius Award by using aquaponics and hydroponics, and all these different methods. And again, that also has a kind of a personal revelation to me too, because of that book. Again, we want to tell the story. Again, when we start publishing, there weren't a lot of books about urban farming in particular. And so we were very interested in this idea, and we want to tell his story. But a number of years ago, I was giving a talk at a high school social justice conference, because, and it's really interesting to talk to, older kids. And what happens at my previous company that I worked with, Leonel Books, I had published Rosa Parks. She was one of my authors, and I traveled with Rosa Parks. And I was asked to speak at the social justice conference in Seattle, because I could share my personal connection with Rosa Parks. And honestly, as you all educators know, when you sit in front of kids and they're not interested, they get pretty restless and they start checking their phones, and then I was just feeling a little bit nervous. And then one of the kids raises his hand and says, and what are you doing now? This is, again, Rosa Parks' book was a number of years ago. And I said, well, I'm just publishing this book about Will Allen. And he says, really fantastic guy in Milwaukee. And the first thing they said is, he's alive? And I said, yes, he's alive. And he says, for you kids to get involved, you can be part of the food movement today. And I have to say, and I said, when Will Allen got started, because he wanted to do a youth program. It wasn't even he was a food and farming person to begin with. In fact, he was a former basketball star, but he got involved because he wanted to provide jobs to youth, and he also wanted to address food access issues in his community. And I can just feel that energy of the class change, right? And all these kids were getting very excited. And then I kind of came away from that day and came back and talked to my wife. Said, from now on, we are only going to do biographies of living people. Not that I'm personally against, I'm a big history fan. And so, and I want kids should know about history, but at least for our approach of storytelling at Readers to Eaters, we want to understand that the food movement is going on now and they can get involved now, and so so the books that you mentioned, so started with the Farmer Will Allen, and then the next book we did was on Alice Waters and the Trip to Delicious, and it's also about her starting the edible schoolyard. And then we did Roy Choi and the Chef Roy Choi and the Street Food Remix, the guy who started the food truck movement in LA, and that became kind of this national trend. And then Sander Katz and Tiny Wild about fermentation. He's a really well-known fermentation writer and educator. And then most recently, this newest book that just came out a few months ago called Farmer Eva's Green Garden Life, about a woman, the first children's book about a woman farmer. Woman farmer wasn't even counted by the USDA till 2002.
Yeah.
And so this is the first book. And this is and so these are all people who are still alive, and not just because they're famous people in food, but the way we want to profile them is they are using food as a way to grow a community. It's not just about what they do, but it's how they kind of connect other people into the food education. And to me, there's let's start up with the Farmer Will Allen book. It's always there's a line in there. It's Will Allen can see what other people can't see. When he sees kids, he sees farmers, and that's always plant the idea in my head. It's it's all people who's been able to see something, beyond the obvious, what's on the plate, and that's how we go about, kind of profiling people. And it's not easy, honestly, to profile living people. It's kind of a moving target, because, their work changes, and, Will Allen's farm closed, and Roy Choi also started a restaurant at the end of this book, but, and it got great accolades, but yet it also closed. And kids come to me and say, well, does that mean that they failed? And again, that leads to another conversation, especially with older high school kids. They say, well, if Will Allen ran a farm for 30 years and closed it, I don't know if I consider that a failure. But even if Roy Choi ran a restaurant for 2 years and it closed, but he said his goal was never to go there for, success isn't measured by making millions of dollars out of this. Success is shining a light in terms of food access into South Central LA. It's providing jobs at this community and building a legacy. And now, if just because my restaurant did not continue, now other people can know how to do this better in these communities. So we can have these much deeper conversations, even with the children's picture books, into high school kids. And so So that's one. And I want to give an example like how we tell stories about people. Again, it's not just about food, right? So with the Roy Choi book, again, we want to do the book because food truck is cool, kids love it. But at the back of the book, we also say, it all comes together because of the 1965 Immigration Act. And because only after 1965, when new immigrants when the policy opened up and new immigrants came, especially Asian immigrants to America, that all these new food was able to come to our plate, basically. Like 1965 Immigration Act, sushi came to America in the early 70s, and it turns out, Roy Choi and this other chef like Dave Chang in New York, they're really famous, or like Korean chef is kind of having a moment in the US right now. And a lot of these chefs were born in the early 70s because they are the children of the post-1965 immigrants. And so it's another way to look at immigration. That again, older kids have a different connection, because immigration can be a very political subject, but it sure makes our food taste better, and again,
yes,
and so it's
like
a different conversation for us to understand immigration, and that's our approach. And like I said, we did a book about Sandra Katz, and Sandra Katz is so well known. So many chefs and farmers market folks follow his work about fermentation, and fermentation is great because there's really not a right way to do fermentation. So kids can get involved, and we do these workshops with kids to do fermentation, like making krauchi, kind of combination of sauerkraut and kimchi, And it's a great way to introduce kids to, again, flavor. It's like, well, what do you add in there? And the fact that you squeeze it and the texture changes on you right there in a matter of, 10 minutes, let's say, and again, for us to say, well, again, this is even for garden folks, so you start with cabbage, but to make it more sweet, you can add carrot, you can add a pear. It's not like you add sugar.
Right.
And so that's another way for kids to understand the taste behind the food that we're eating from the garden. So fermentation is really great in that way. We're doing a lot of partnerships at like library and summer meal programs, because they don't have to have a kitchen to do a cooking program, or at least a food program, because fermentation is all like room temperature food, and so you don't need a heating unit. And so it's really great as a way to introduce kids.
Well, Philip, we've talked about so far about food and nutrition, how it's different, how we talk about that. We've talked about the cultural differences with some of the books, fictional characters, as well as non-fictional and cultural references. Kind of curious now, has there any area that is on your radar that you haven't dealt yet, or what's in the future for Readers to Eaters? Where do you see yourself going?
A lot. I mean, again, this goes back to when we first started. People keep thinking, why just publish books about food, right? And this goes, and we always feel like food is a great connector, and I kind of name any subject, and I can give you food as an example. So of course, again, we talk about, health and nutrition is kind of the baseline, but we can certainly use food to talk about STEM education. But as even the example I gave you, some of our books, we can use it to talk about immigration. We can use it to talk about social justice. We can talk about certainly climate issues. And so again, we can springboard to almost every subject and use food back as something that is very concrete. Again, like we can talk about climate issues, and it's so overwhelming to most kids that it's like we don't know where to go with that, right? But then if you talk about back to what does that mean to your plate, then we understand, and then we can take these small steps.
Hey, we want to thank you, Philip, so much for being on the show today. It's been truly wonderful listening to you.
Really enjoyed talking to you both. Yeah.
Thank you. Farm to School was written, directed, and produced by Rick Sherman and Michelle Markison, with production support from Leanne Lochner at Oregon State University. Thanks, Leanne. And made possible by a grant from the United States Department of Agriculture.
The content and ideas from the Farm to School podcast does not necessarily reflect the opinions of Oregon State University, Oregon Department of Education, the United States Department of Agriculture, or Readers to Eaters. The USDA, Oregon Department of Ed, and Oregon State University are equal opportunity providers and employers.
Do you want to learn more about Farm to School? bees or worms, Philip. Check out other episodes, show notes, contact information, and so much more by Googling up Farm to School Podcast, OSU.
We would
Get right to
love
us.
to hear from you. Please stop by the website Michelle just mentioned to say hello or give us an idea for a future podcast. Thanks, everyone, and thanks again, Philip.
Bye, Philip.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Yes. Bye.